I have walked through St. Fridswide's College more times than I care to admit, though rarely for reasons that would flatter my character. On some nights, it was the promise of a half-forgotten memory that led me beneath the old archway. On others, it was the stubborn refusal to go home to a flat that had become little more than an archive of my own unfulfilled days. But that night, the one that still returns to me in those uneasy hours before dawn, I found myself lingering without purpose, allowing the soft echo of choir rehearsals to drift across the quad like a gentle accusation. The sound came from the chapel, of course. It always did, but memory has a curious way of dressing the ordinary in garments borrowed from the past, and I could not hear those voices without recalling a woman I once thought I loved. She had sung in a choir very like this one, perhaps too like it, her voice floating above the others with a clarity I mistook for something personal. I stood near the archway and found myself listening for her tone, her phrasing, that little rise she used on the second beat of a phrase. It wasn't there, naturally. Why should it have been? Yet I waited all the same. It was while I lingered, half indulging nostalgia, half mocking myself for it, that I noticed the light, a faint, persistent glow from a window overlooking the quad. The hour was late. The college had quieted to that monastic stillness only ancient walls can produce, a silence so complete it feels engineered. The light should not have been there. Rooms assigned to visitors were usually kept dark at night, part of some long-standing effort to maintain the college's image of solemn restraint. But the glow persisted, a pale square against the dark stone, flickering as though someone were moving inside. I told myself it was merely an overworked scholar or an insomniac student. In Oxford, one grows accustomed to the sight of solitary figures hunched over desks at ungodly hours, their ambitions lit more brightly than their lamps. And yet there was something quietly insistent about that light, an impression that it was not illuminating work, but hiding it. I told myself this and continued walking, determined not to indulge the kind of curiosity that had caused me so much personal inconvenience over the years. By the time I reached the lodge, the light had already slipped from my thoughts. I exchanged a few words with the porter, harmless remarks about the weather, the usual talk meant to fill the corners of an otherwise empty night, and stepped back into the broader quiet of Oxford streets. The air carried the smell of rain on old stone, that unmistakable tang of damp earth and history. I should have gone home then, but I found myself standing still, unable to sever the thread of memory the choir had drawn tight inside me. When I finally did return to my flat, it was with the vague discomfort of someone who has glimpsed the edge of a pattern, but is not ready to name it. I poured myself a modest whiskey, opened the window to let in the night air, and tried to read. But the words blurred too easily, replaced by the faint glow behind the archway, and the sensation that I had overlooked something, not dramatic, not even troubling, but quietly out of place. The next morning arrived with the usual dullness, and I had almost succeeded in convincing myself that the night had been nothing more than one of those sentimental episodes men of my age occasionally suffer. It was the newspaper that contradicted me, not the headlines. Those were filled with the usual disheartening catalogue of human folly. It was a small column tucked between a feature on local orchestras and a notice about a council meeting. A visiting American professor had died suddenly at St. Fridswide's College. No details, no alarm, just a sentence and a name. But something in the phrasing, too cautious, too bare, caught at me. And before I had even finished my first cup of tea, I felt that reluctant, familiar interest tightening its quiet grip. By the time I reached the college the following morning, a thin drizzle had settled over Oxford, softening the outlines of the towers and cloisters until they appeared half-drawn, as though the city itself had not quite committed to waking. Lewis was waiting for me near the lodge, hands tucked awkwardly into his coat pockets, shifting his weight with the sort of anxious patience he reserved for mornings when he suspected my temper might be fragile. He murmured that the death had been ruled accidental for the moment, a fall, nothing more, and that the deceased, Professor Avery Hartwell, had been staying in a guest room overlooking the quad. There was no reason, he added, to think otherwise. I didn't reply. The porter, a balding man with eyes that darted too quickly, led us up the narrow staircase toward the room. The wood beneath our feet creaked with a complaint that felt older than any of us. Something in the air smelled faintly of old paper and extinguished candles, one of those scents Oxford seems to exhale at will. The professor's door stood open now, but the porter assured us it had been locked when they found it. Locked from the inside. The implication hung between us with the subtle weight of a half-finished thought. Lewis looked as though he wanted to dismiss it, but even he could see the irregularity. Inside, the room felt smaller than it should have, crowded not by furniture, but by an atmosphere of lingering occupation. A coat still draped over a chair, a pair of spectacles resting on a book spine, an unfinished cup of tea. I've walked into too many rooms after too many deaths not to sense the peculiar tension left behind when someone has departed more abruptly than intended. The window latch showed no signs of interference. The porter said the room could only be locked from within, and yet the position of the fallen body, described to us with uncomfortable precision, suggested a struggle, or at least a moment of sharp, unexpected imbalance. Lewis bent over the desk, examining a sheaf of papers with diligent innocence. I studied the half-completed crossword left open beside them. A clue had been filled incorrectly, though not clumsily. A misquoted line from Tennyson. I remembered it too clearly to mistake it. The professor had written a version that never existed. Either he had been careless, or someone else had tampered with it. It wasn't proof of anything, of course. Just a flicker of something out of place, the kind of detail that whispers rather than speaks. The book beside the crossword was a slim anthology of Victorian verse. I lifted it, turning it over in my hands. A thin crease marked one particular poem, an elegy on lost ambition. Whoever had been reading it had gone over a single stanza more than once. The faint smudge of a thumbprint confirmed as much. I couldn't help wondering what drew him to it. Lewis asked the porter whether anyone had visited the professor that night. The porter hesitated before recalling the faint sound of voices around 9. He couldn't say whose. Scholars often wandered the corridors after dinner, discussing matters far more profound than the hour deserved, or so they believed. I stepped closer to the bed. A small scuff along the floorboards caught my attention, barely visible, easily dismissed, but its shape suggested something had been moved recently. Perhaps the professor himself had shifted the furniture, or perhaps someone else had. The drizzle outside tapped steadily against the window as though echoing the question. We left the room a few minutes later, though my thoughts lingered behind like unwelcome guests. In the corridor, I asked Lewis whether the professor had enemies. Lewis shrugged. Academics always had rivals, he said. Sometimes the difference was only one of degree. As we descended the staircase, I glanced once more toward the quad. The window where I had seen the light the night before seemed perfectly ordinary now. No trace of its quiet defiance. Yet the memory pressed against me with renewed insistence. A room locked from the inside. A misquoted poem, a scuff in the floor. A light burning when it should not have. Individually nothing, collectively. The faint outline of something not yet ready to reveal itself. It was one of those Oxford afternoons when the city seemed to fold itself inward, as though retreating into its own history. A low mist drifted across the quad at St. Fridswide's, softening the outlines of the stone staircases until they appeared suspended in a half-remembered dream. Lewis remarked that the weather felt like an inconvenience. I found it closer to a warning. Fog has a talent for turning certainty into conjecture, and on that day I felt the edges of the case settling into that same indistinct blur. We were to speak with 3 members of the college, scholars of unimpeachable intelligence and questionable honesty. The combination, in my experience, was rarely accidental. The first was Dr. Helena Ward, a lecturer whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by her reputation for making enemies. She greeted us in her rooms with an expression that suggested we were interrupting something more important than a police inquiry. Her voice held that brittle precision one finds among academics who believe emotion is a form of weakness. She assured us she had barely known Professor Hartwell. Their paths had crossed only in passing. She used the phrase "in passing" twice, as though repetition might make it true. But there was something in the way she glanced toward a stack of letters on her desk. Just once, quickly, but with the unmistakable reflex of someone guarding a private correspondence. I asked a casual question about Hartwell's field of study. She recited his academic interests with the fluency of someone who had studied them closely. Too closely for a mere acquaintance. Lewis didn't notice. I did, though I pretended not to. Our second encounter took place in the cloister walk, where a young fellow named Daniel Hargreaves stood beneath an archway, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound notebook. He was one of those bright, fragile scholars the university produces every decade or so, men who look as though they possess a mind too large for their own nerves. When he saw us, he snapped the notebook shut with the guilty reflex of someone who has learned to hide his thoughts before others can judge them. He spoke of Hartwell with an anxious reverence. The American professor, he said, had been kind to him, generous with his guidance. He insisted there had been nothing unusual about their last conversation, though the tremor in his voice betrayed something unsaid. I asked whether Hartwell had ever mentioned travel. The hotel receipt we'd found still sat heavily in my mind. Hargreaves hesitated, then shook his head. But his hesitation, that small pause before denial, felt heavier than anything he actually said. Our final visit brought us to the senior common room, where Dr. Lionel Swithin sat near the fire, reading a battered anthology of essays. He was one of those charming older dons who managed to appear benign while harboring resentments sharp enough to slice through the thickest collegial niceties. He greeted us cordially and expressed his sorrow at Hartwell's passing with perfectly measured sadness. Too measured, perhaps. A sadness rehearsed. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Hartwell's lectures had been well received, but the tone suggested otherwise. And when he remarked that visiting academics sometimes failed to understand the subtleties of the college's traditions, I heard not a criticism of etiquette, but of trespass. An outsider stepping too close to something he should have left alone. As we left the common room, the fog had thickened. The quad lay in a soft, indistinct hush. Lewis walked ahead, his footsteps muffled against the damp stone. Remained for a moment beneath the archway, allowing the silence to settle. 3 scholars, a woman guarding her letters, a nervous poet hiding his notebook, and a senior don whose charm masked old grievances. Each had known Hartwell better than they were willing to admit. Each carried a small, almost invisible fracture in their composure, and each had offered a version of events that aligned too neatly with the others. It was the neatness that troubled me. Life in Oxford is rarely tidy. Academia, even less so. When stories begin to match too smoothly, it usually means someone has pressed them into alignment. As we crossed the quad, a distant bicycle bell sounded from somewhere within the fog, sharp, out of place, almost deliberate. It echoed longer than it should have, as though the fog wished to hold it. I couldn't explain why, but that solitary ring felt like the case drawing its first real breath. I've always found something faintly intrusive about reading another person's diary, even when the demands of an investigation make it unavoidable. Perhaps it is because diaries expose their writers in ways conversation never does. Unguarded, unpolished, stripped of the careful mannerisms by which most people defend themselves. Professor Hartwell's diary, discovered in a drawer beneath a few scattered conference programs, struck me at once as the work of a man who believed in clarity more than concealment. Neatly written entries, short observations, a certain almost pedantic orderliness. Yet a page had been removed. Not torn, not carelessly wrenched, but excised with the deliberation of someone who feared that even a single sentence might matter. Lewis commented that it might have been the professor himself who had removed it. I didn't contradict him, but I doubted it. The absence of something is often more suggestive than its presence, and the smooth, precise cut told me the removal was recent. Too recent. I read the remaining entries twice. The tone shifted in a manner so slight that Lewis didn't notice it. The sort of tonal drift that appears when a man begins writing for someone else rather than for himself. The earlier entries were brisk accounts of lectures and meetings, the sort of academic life that oscillates between ambition and disappointment. The later ones felt different. Shorter sentences, a faint self-consciousness, as though the professor had begun to imagine a listener. Near the back of the diary, folded unusually carefully, I found a hotel receipt. It bore initials that matched none of the names we had encountered so far. Lewis speculated it might belong to a colleague or a friend, but the handwriting struck me as feminine, elegant, almost ceremonially neat. I asked the porter whether any women had visited the professor. He frowned, said he wasn't sure, then added that visitors were common enough and rarely recorded. The answer was so vague it felt rehearsed. The stairwell outside the professor's room was cool and dim, its air carrying the faint smell of chalk dust and damp stone. I lingered there, trying to imagine the missing page. A man doesn't remove part of his diary unless the words on it carry weight, and a man doesn't keep a receipt belonging to someone else unless that person means something. I slipped the receipt back into the diary, if only to restore the illusion that I hadn't disturbed it. Lewis suggested we visit the college library to see if Hartwell had borrowed anything recently. The library at St. Frida's possesses that peculiar stillness one finds only in places where many minds have labored, a quiet shaped by centuries of thought. As we walked between the tall shelves, I felt an odd impression that the professor had been here often. There was something in the air around the poetry section, a faint disturbance of dust on a particular shelf, that suggested a book had been removed repeatedly in recent days. A middle-aged librarian, sharp-eyed, soft-voiced, approached us. She said she remembered Hartwell. He had spent some time looking through the anthologies. When I asked whether he'd seemed distressed or distracted, she paused with that delicate hesitation people display when they wish to tell the truth without revealing too much. He looked as though he was waiting for something, she said. Or someone. Her phrasing lingered with me as we left the library. Waiting for something, waiting for someone. Small distinctions, yet crucial. I thought again of the missing page, the tonal shift in the entries, the neat handwriting on the receipt. A man awaits a message, perhaps, or a visit, or a confession. But whatever he waited for had arrived differently than he expected. Outside, the fog had thinned into a soft haze, giving the college an air of deliberate secrecy. As Lewis spoke about arranging interviews, my attention drifted to the diary's faint indentation on my glove. The pressure of something unresolved. A missing page, a misplaced receipt, a shift in tone. None of them significant on their own. But together, they formed a whisper, one I felt I'd heard before, somewhere in another quiet corridor of another unexplained death. If there is one thing I've learned in my wanderings through Oxford's older colleges, it is that libraries are rarely silent in the way visitors expect. They breathe, they murmur, they hold the soft rustle of pages, the faint groan of aging wood, the discreet shifting of weight from one foot to another as scholars move reluctantly between shelves. When Lewis and I stepped back into the St. Fritzwide's library that afternoon, I felt as though the building was listening to us rather than the other way around. The librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Gray, waited behind the central desk, arranging a stack of returned books with a delicacy that suggested a kind of ritual rather than a chore. I recognized her from earlier, that quiet assurance, the unassuming intelligence that so often goes unnoticed by the sort of men who mistake academic rank for genuine insight. She looked up at me with an expression that felt strangely familiar, though I could not recall if our paths had crossed before this case. She remembered Professor Hartwell more clearly than most. He had been a courteous visitor, she said, though perhaps more earnest than expected. He spent time in the poetry aisle, lingering over a single anthology as though its pages held some private significance. Her voice was low, controlled, almost careful, as if she feared disturbing whatever remained of the man's presence. Lewis asked whether Hartwell had spoken much. Mrs. Gray offered a faint smile, thoughtful, not amused. He spoke when spoken to, she said. He asked about obscure Victorian poets, and once, rather hesitantly, about inscriptions in old editions. She added that he had seemed preoccupied, though not in a troubled way, more in the manner of someone carrying a thought too delicate to share. Her phrasing held me, too delicate to share, a nuance that revealed more than she intended. I asked whether anyone had joined Hartwell in the library during his visits. At this, she hesitated, not dramatically, but with that small, almost imperceptible tightening of the eyes that intelligent people make when weighing the consequences of honesty. She said a woman had spoken with him one afternoon, briefly, near the poetry shelves. She couldn't recall her face, or perhaps she preferred not to. She remembered only a hand brushing the edge of a book, a moment of quiet recognition, and the odd impression that the two already understood each other before a word was spoken. Lewis murmured that it could have been a student. Mrs. Gray shook her head with a soft certainty. Older, she said. Someone who carried herself like a scholar, but moved as though she had something to lose. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't even a suspicion. It was an observation, and I trusted it. While Lewis continued with his polite questions, my attention drifted toward the poetry section. The aisle carried the faintest scent of dust and old parchment, the sort of smell that anchors itself to memory. I ran my fingers along the spines, stopping at the anthology I'd seen in Hartwell's room, a slender volume with a faded blue cover. When I opened it, a thin mark in the binding revealed where a page had been pressed more often than the others. The poem at that place dealt with longing, disappointment, and the peculiar intimacy of shared silence. I caught myself reading the stanza twice, and wondered if Hartwell had done the same, and whether he had done so alone. Mrs. Gray watched me from a distance. Her gaze was steady, not intrusive, an assessment, perhaps, of my intentions. When I returned the book to the shelf, she stepped closer. She said quietly that Hartwell's expression often changed when he reached that poem. Not sadness, not fear. Something gentler, almost hopeful. She said she recognized that look. She had seen it on others, on men waiting for someone to understand them without speaking. As we walked back across the quad, Lewis remarked that the librarian seemed observant. The understatement made me smile. Mrs. Gray was far more than observant. She was the kind of woman who noticed details others overlooked, not because she was nosy, but because she understood the language of faces. And it struck me then, with a faint, insistent clarity, that whatever Hartwell had been waiting for, whatever secret lay folded between his diary and the missing page, Mrs. Gray had glimpsed it first. Not through words, through the small, unguarded truths that pass across a person's face before they can compose themselves. There are evenings in Oxford when the air feels steeped in something older than the city itself. An accumulation of murmured arguments, forgotten lectures, and the soft clink of glasses raised in celebration or regret. The small wine reception at St. Fridwide's that night possessed precisely that atmosphere. I had never much cared for such gatherings, but Lewis insisted that it might encourage the scholars to speak more freely. He said wine loosened tongues. I replied that wine merely made liars more confident. Still, we went. The senior common room was warm and dimly lit, its windows fogged from the contrast between the cold outside and the hum of conversation within. A fire crackled discreetly, as though embarrassed by its own enthusiasm. The scholars stood in scattered groups, each cluster orbiting its own constellation of academic grievances. I noticed Dr. Ward near the mantelpiece, her eyes glinting with the icy precision I'd seen earlier. Hargreaves hovered near the bookshelves, looking as though he wished he could dissolve into them. Dr. Swithin, unfailingly affable, unfailingly insincere, held court near the wine table. Lewis gravitated toward Swithin, perhaps hoping charm would yield cooperation. I drifted instead toward a quiet corner, my glass held more out of habit than desire. I watched the room, letting the rhythms settle, laughter that felt a shade too sharp, murmurs that pulled back just as they neared candor, and the occasional glance toward the door, as if someone expected an arrival that never came. It was Swithin who delivered the moment I still think of as the misheard confession. His voice carried across the room in that genial, faintly theatrical manner of his. He had been speaking about Hartwell, praising him ostensibly, when he said something that stopped me mid-sip. He remarked that some people simply do not know when to leave well enough alone. And the way he said it, lightly, almost affectionately, felt wrong. Not the words, but the intonation, a softness pressed onto something harder, as though the sentence had once existed in a far less benign form. Lewis, catching only the surface of the remark, nodded politely and asked a question I didn't hear. I was listening to the tone, beneath Swithin's voice, the faint tremor of irritation polished smooth by habit. A man doesn't perfect such tonal management unless he has practiced concealing sharper truths. I moved closer, blending into a group of listeners. Swithin continued. Hartwell had been ambitious, of course, but harmless. A good scholar, keen to understand the subtleties of the college. Keen, he repeated. The word lodged in my mind with a faint insistence. There was something in it, something that felt less like praise and more like warning. I asked him, casually, what subtleties Hartwell had been so eager to learn. Swithin's smile tightened. He said Hartwell had been curious about traditions, about relationships between departments, about rivalries best left unspoken, all delivered in the tone of someone reciting phrases he hoped would sound neutral. Across the room, I saw Hargreaves observing us with a kind of tremulous anxiety. His eyes flicked between Swithin and Dr. Ward as though trying to interpret a silent exchange. I followed his gaze. Ward's posture had shifted, slightly, but enough for someone like me to notice. She was no longer speaking to the colleague beside her. She was listening to Swithin, listening too intently. It was Ward, not Swithin, who gave me the second detail of the night. She raised her glass to her lips, but her eyes betrayed a different focus. A glance toward the corner where the poetry volumes sat in their glass case. A brief glance, but loaded. As if something in that corner held a memory she wished to bury, but could not ignore. The room's warmth grew oppressive. I stepped out into the corridor for air. Lewis joined me a moment later, asking what I thought of Swithin's remarks. I told him they were almost helpful. Almost. Lewis frowned, waiting for more. I said that sometimes the truth hides not in what is said, but in the small fracture a careless tone leaves behind. As we left the college, the night air felt colder than expected. The fog had thinned, but the silence carried a weight of its own. I found myself thinking again of Swithin's phrase. Some people simply do not know when to leave well enough alone, and wondered whether he had meant Hartwell or himself. There are nights when Oxford feels less like a city than a memory unfolding in real time, each step echoing something half-forgotten and uncomfortably intimate. I returned to St. Fridswide's just before midnight, driven less by determination than by that faint inward pull I have never been able to name. The case had begun to thicken around me in the way difficult cases always do. Quietly, insistently, like the tightening of a knot. I told myself I was only retracing the professor's final movements. In truth, I think I was searching for a rhythm, a pattern I might have overlooked. The quad lay in a hush so complete that even the buildings seemed to be listening. A thin mist hovered just above the cobblestones, stirred only by the occasional breath of wind that moved through the archways like a whisper in an empty cathedral. The chapel windows were dark now, though I imagined I could still hear the memory of the choir that had once kept me rooted beneath those very stones. I paused near the place where I had first noticed the late-night glow. The window appeared lifeless tonight, its panes blank and indifferent, but something lingered in the air, a faint tension, perhaps, or merely my own imagination reshaping the scene to justify my being there. Either way, it compelled me to step into the stairwell and climb toward the landing above Hartwell's room. The corridor was colder than I expected. A draft pressed against the back of my neck as though urging me not to continue. But I moved on until I found the narrow passageway that led to a set of old rooms seldom used except for visiting guests. I'd walked past these doors in daylight without noticing them. At night, they felt charged with a different significance. That was when I saw it, a faint line of light leaking from beneath one of the doors. Not bright, not bold, just a thin blade cutting across the floorboards. I stood very still. Midnight light in an empty guest corridor. Something stirred behind the wood. The quiet shift of weight, or perhaps just the settling of furniture. I knocked softly. Silence answered. When I pressed the handle, the door yielded without resistance and opened into a room that was almost bare. A desk, a narrow bed, a single lamp burning on the corner of the table, and beneath the desk drawer, taped carefully as though someone feared it might slip away, was a photograph. I knew at once it had not been placed there by the college. It bore the kind of sentimental arrangement that academics pretend not to indulge. 5 figures standing in front of a summer garden. 3 scholars, younger then, a librarian, Mrs. Gray unmistakably, though her expression was lighter, unguarded, and Hartwell, positioned slightly apart from the others, as if unsure whether he belonged in the picture at all. The photograph unsettled me more than I expected, not because of who appeared in it, but because of the deliberate way it had been hidden. Someone had wanted it close, but not visible. I removed it gently, the tape lifting with a small sigh. The moment felt strangely intimate, as though I were trespassing not on a crime scene, but on a memory still alive for someone. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. I was alone with the quiet weight of the image. And then a deduction, small but insistent, emerged. The torn diary page, the hotel receipt, the tonal shift in Hartwell's writing. They all suggested a past resurging, not a present unfolding. This photograph belonged to that past, a past shared by all 5 individuals. A draft brushed across the back of my hand. I turned and saw that the window, though closed, rattled faintly in its frame. Outside, the quad glimmered with the pale sheen of mist. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 12. The sound wandered through the college with the weary grace of an old truth resurfacing. I slipped the photograph into my coat and left the room exactly as I had found it, save for the absence of that one hidden memory. As I stepped back into the quad, the mist shifted around me like a thought still unformed, and I realized that the case had passed some invisible threshold. Whatever had happened to Hartwell did not begin with his death. It began years earlier, in the company of those 5 faces. The morning began with a knock at my door far too early for anyone with manners, which meant it could only have been Lewis. He stood there with an expression that suggested equal parts discomfort and obligation, holding a small evidence envelope as though it might sting him. Someone had left it at the station, he said. No name, no explanation, no attempt at theatrical mystery. Just the envelope, placed neatly on the front desk by a person the constable on duty could not recall in detail. People rarely remember what they don't expect. Inside the envelope was the missing diary page. I sat down slowly, not because I feared its contents, but because there is something unnerving about an object that chooses its own moment to reappear. The page had been folded once, carefully and unfolded with equal care. Whoever returned it had not wanted to destroy it, only to delay it. I smoothed it across my knee and began to read. The handwriting matched Hartwell's, but the tone did not. It was not an entry at all. It was a message, a short, unfinished expression of regret, or hope, or something poised between the two. The oddity lay not in the sentiment, but in the way the words curved inward, as though addressed to someone he trusted enough to drop his guarded precision. A brief apology for some silence left too long. A sentence that ended prematurely, as though interrupted, or interrupted himself. Lewis hovered nearby, waiting for my verdict. I read it again, aloud in my mind, listening to the rhythm. Something felt wrong. Hartwell's other entries had been clipped, structured. This one breathed differently. And there it was, the shift I'd sensed before, the sense of writing for another person. The missing page made that undeniable. I asked Lewis whether the envelope had contained anything else. He shook his head, but he added, almost as an afterthought, that the constable remembered the visitor's coat, a long, dark one, the sort worn by half the academics in Oxford. A detail too vague to be useful except for the timing. Early morning, before the first lectures, before most students had even left their rooms. A deliberate hour. We returned to St. Fridarswyde's, the quad still damp from a night of unsettled weather. As we crossed it, I found myself studying the windows again, their blankness, their uniform indifference. It struck me that the college's beauty depended on its refusal to confess anything. The stones kept their secrets. People tried to emulate them. In the library, Mrs. Gray looked up with a faint tension in her expression, as though she already knew what we carried. She asked if there had been any progress. I gave her a deliberately opaque answer. Her eyes drifted for a moment toward the poetry shelves. A small motion, a defensive one. I tucked the observation away. Later, in the deserted corridor near Hartwell's room, Lewis asked whether I believed the returning of the page was meant as a gesture of guilt. I told him guilt rarely announces itself so politely. This felt more like fear or desperation, or the remnants of a promise someone was reluctant to break. What struck me more was the pronoun shift. In the message, Hartwell had written not about events, but to someone. You, he had written once. Then again, you must believe I did not. The sentence ended there. The abruptness troubled me. It didn't read like a man lacking courage, but like a man lacking time. A gust rattled the old windows. I felt the cold through my coat. Standing there in that corridor, the photograph in my pocket suddenly seemed heavier. 5 people who had once shared a moment. 1 dead. 4 living with its shadow. And now a page returned, not to exonerate or condemn, but to nudge the truth nearer the surface. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him the truth was circling us, narrowing with each fragment that returned to its place. The missing page had not been meant to vanish forever, only long enough. Long enough for something or someone to prepare for what must come next. And as I folded the page back into its envelope, I felt the unmistakable sensation that someone else, somewhere in the college, knew I had read it and was waiting. There are times in an investigation when progress arrives not as revelation but as a faint disturbance, like the tremor of a loose floorboard or the way a single raindrop slides down a window pane against gravity. That morning, sitting alone at my desk with the returned diary page beside me, I felt such a disturbance. It nudged at me from somewhere on the edge of memory, neither urgent nor ignorable. The crossword from Hartwell's room, abandoned half-finished, had unsettled me from the beginning, but it was only now, with the missing page restored, that I sensed the puzzle had not been a pastime. It had been a message. I retrieved the photograph from my coat, the 5 faces arranged in false summer harmony. The scholars, the librarian, the visiting professor. A shared past circled by unspoken resentments. I set the photograph beside the diary page and the crossword. The 3 objects formed a rough triangle, an arrangement that struck me as accidental only if one believed in coincidence. I never have. Lewis joined me shortly after, his expression carrying the weary hope of someone expecting progress. I asked him whether he remembered the incorrect Tennyson clue in the crossword. He frowned, said he barely recalled it. I told him the misquotation bothered me. Hartwell had been a careful man. Too careful to misquote a line simple enough for any undergraduate to catch, and the change he made, small as it was, directed the meaning toward a different stanza entirely, one dealing with thresholds and vantage points. Lewis stared at me blankly. I explained with some reluctance that poetry often reveals more in what it avoids than in what it states. Hartwell had circled an idea rather than naming it. And then I remembered something else, the narrow, almost hidden corridor behind the guest rooms. The one most visitors never noticed unless guided there. A vantage point, a threshold, a place one might use to create the illusion of solitude. I stood abruptly and asked Lewis to accompany me back to St. Friedeswide's. He obeyed, though not without a murmur about the number of times we had walked those stones already. When we arrived, the sky hung low with a promise of unfallen rain. The quad felt unnervingly still, as if waiting for someone to break its surface. Inside the guest corridor, I studied the floor as though reading a text I had once memorized and forgotten. The scuff I'd noticed earlier, barely a mark, felt newly significant. It pointed not toward Hartwell's room, but slightly away, toward the side passage that curved behind the adjoining wall. A place where sound distorted, where footsteps carried strangely, and where a person might observe without being observed. Lewis asked what I was looking for. I told him I wasn't sure, which was only partly a lie. I followed the narrow corridor to its end. The passage bent twice, then opened onto a small alcove with a window facing the quad. A cramped, forgotten corner made for marginalized architecture. Dust lay thick on the sill, except for a faint interruption, an oval where something had rested recently. A glass, perhaps, or a hand. I thought again of the misquoted clue. Not crossing the threshold, but watching from it. Not solitude, but the illusion of it. And the neatness of the locked room mystery began, for the first time, to crumble. Someone had known the layout well enough to exploit it. Someone who had walked these corridors for years, cultivating familiarity with spaces others ignored. The photograph flickered in my mind. 5 people, one of them standing slightly apart, as if unsure of belonging. But the position that mattered now was the opposite. The person who had always belonged too comfortably. The one who understood the college's secrets not as curiosities, but as habits. Lewis asked whether I was suggesting a theory. I said theories were untrustworthy companions. They encouraged the investigator to see only what fit. But a detail, a subtle one, easily dismissed, was something different. It opened possibilities rather than closing them. He asked which detail I meant. I told him it wasn't a detail as much as a direction, a vantage point, a place from which a person might witness another's fall without witnessing their guilt. As we left the alcove, the first drop of rain landed on the window, trailing slowly downward. It felt like an echo of something Hartwell had tried to express in his crossword. Not a word, but a position. a place where truth hides until someone bothers to stand where the poet once stood and look outward, not inward. Only then does the pattern begin to change. I've often believed that the final steps toward the truth are rarely taken in triumph. More often, they are taken in something closer to resignation, a quiet acceptance that a pattern you hoped might dissolve has instead solidified in front of you. That was the feeling that settled on me as I stood in the alcove once more, the faint imprint on the sill still visible beneath the dust. Whoever had stood there had waited long enough to leave a mark, long enough to watch. Lewis joined me reluctantly, his expression caught between confusion and an unwilling recognition of what the evidence suggested. He asked whether I thought Hartwell had been pushed. I told him the answer was no longer the important part. What mattered was the vantage point. Someone had chosen this place not by chance, but by memory. Memory born of long residence, of belonging. We returned to the quad, the afternoon light weak and unpersuasive. The stones shone faintly from a recent drizzle, their reflections giving the impression of a surface shifting underfoot. I asked Lewis to gather the scholars. Not formally, just enough that each felt the subtle pressure of being observed. I wanted to see them together, in proximity, without the shielding architecture of their rooms. They arrived with varying degrees of reluctance. Dr. Ward, poised and brittle as ever. Hargreaves, anxious, fingers worrying the spine of a notebook he would not open. And Dr. Swithin, calm, companionable, his smile curving with the gentle confidence of a man accustomed to diffusing tensions rather than provoking them. I asked them about Hartwell's last evening. Small questions, harmless questions. Questions that appeared almost perfunctory until one looked too closely. Ward answered crisply. She seemed almost irritated by the need to repeat herself. Hargreaves spoke with his usual tremor, but his eyes darted only toward Ward, never toward Swithin. And Swithin, with his practiced geniality, offered comments polished smooth by years of convivial diplomacy. Yet beneath that surface, something shifted. He made a remark, light, dismissive, about how Americans often misunderstood the architecture of the older colleges. It was meant to be humorous, but he spoke with the same tonal softness he had used at the wine reception. That polished softness, as though filing down an edge he knew would otherwise cut too sharply. It was the detail that broke the pattern open. I asked him, still gently, whether he recalled ever showing Hartwell the more obscure parts of the college, the hidden alcoves, the narrow passages. He hesitated, only for a moment, but long enough. He said he might have done so by accident. The phrasing, too careful, too curated, gave him away. Ward's expression flickered with something that looked like relief. Hargreaves closed his notebook as though shutting a door he had feared might remain open. And Swithin, sensing the shift, inhaled with a weary resignation that felt less like guilt and more like inevitability. When the others had gone, he asked whether I intended to accuse him. I said accusation was not my profession. Interpretation was. And the interpretation was painfully simple. Hartwell had expected someone that night, someone he trusted, someone he had met years earlier, long before the polite resentments of academic life had hardened into something sharper. The missing diary page had not been a message of fear, but of reconciliation. You must believe I did not. The unfinished apology had not been meant for a stranger. Swithin's shoulders sank, the gesture almost imperceptible. He said Hartwell had once been a friend who had resurfaced unexpectedly, stirring memories he had spent years trying to quiet. The truth, he murmured, was that old loyalties are more dangerous than new rivalries, and he had tried to convince Hartwell to leave the past alone. The room fell silent then, not the silence of confession, but of fatigue. When Lewis and I stepped back into the quad, the light had dimmed into the soft gray of early evening. A breeze moved through the archway, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone. I realized, with a heaviness I could not name, that the vantage point which had revealed the truth was not architectural at all. It was emotional, a heart watching another heart falter. I returned to St. Fridswide's late that evening, not because the case demanded anything further of me, but because something in me resisted the idea of leaving it behind too abruptly. Oxford has never been a city that rewards sudden departures. It prefers a slower unraveling, a lingering step, a final look at what might have been overlooked. And so I found myself beneath the archway once more, listening to the faint murmur of choir rehearsals, drifting from the chapel like a memory barely holding itself together. The voices were indistinct at first, only fragments of harmony carried on the cold air, but gradually the melody gathered shape, threading itself through the stones with that peculiar melancholy sacred music always seems to acquire at night. It reminded me of another evening, long ago, when I had stood in a different college quad listening to a voice I believed would alter the course of my life. It hadn't, of course, but the illusion had been sweet enough to cling to. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. He had said, with that awkward sensitivity he tries to summon on such occasions, that Swithin's statement would require careful wording. I told him it wasn't a statement. It was a confession no one intended to make. He replied that the law needed certainty. I said certainty rarely existed in the places where people's hearts break. Now, standing alone, I felt the weight of that truth settle more fully. Swithin had not meant for things to end as they had, but meaning and consequence rarely march side by side. His vantage upon Hartwell that night had been an attempt at persuasion, not violence, a plea shaped by old affection and older disappointment. And when Hartwell slipped, or stepped wrongly, or hesitated, it was not malice that followed him down the stairs, but the fractured remnants of a friendship neither man had quite been able to mend. Such things do not sit easily in official reports. I walked toward the center of the quad, the mist curling around my feet like an animal unsure of my intentions. A faint glow emanated once more from the window where I had first seen it days ago, a student's lamp this time. Nothing more. Yet its constancy unsettled me. Light where there should be darkness. Presence where absence was expected. The world has a talent for echoing itself in ways we cannot predict. I sat briefly on the cold stone bench near the chapel wall. The choir shifted to a different piece, gentler, more contemplative. Not sorrow, exactly. Something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps. The voices rose and fell with a restraint that reminded me of Hartwell's handwriting on that unfinished page. You must believe I did not. Those 5 words had troubled me more than any of the evidence, not because of what he meant, but because of what he feared would remain misunderstood. I took out the photograph, still tucked safely in my coat. The 5 faces stared back at me, frozen in a moment none of them could have imagined would lead here. Youth has a way of forging promises that time later forces us to break. I wondered whether any of them had recognized that the page returned to me was less about guilt and more about a plea for someone, anyone, to understand the severity of a past long dismissed. The choir's final cadence drifted through the archway, dissolving into the night like the tail end of a whispered apology. I closed the photograph, slid it back into my pocket, and stood. There was nothing more to discover, only the quiet ache of knowledge gained too late to do any good. As I stepped toward the gate, a last chord lingered in the air, suspended, unresolved. It seemed to hold itself there deliberately, as though reminding me that endings in Oxford are rarely neat. Rarely final, rarely anything more than the soft dimming of a light behind a window. I walked on, letting the chord fade behind me, though some part of it followed.